If you are going through a serious illness or maybe recovering from major trauma, something as simple as eating can suddenly become this incredibly critical and frankly complicated challenge. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're not just talking about, simple dietary advice. We're really opening up the playbook on essential pharmacology. We're looking at how clinicians deliver life-saving nutritional support when the body's own systems are, well, offline. This is about using chemical building blocks to keep the engine running.
Exactly. We're tackling malnutrition prevention and management here. And the ultimate objective, it really relates directly to metabolic control. We're trying our best to promote anabolism. That's the constructive tissue-building phase where the body converts simple substances into the complex tissues it needs for things like healing and immunity. And crucially, we have to fight catabolism. That's the destructive process. It's where the body starts essentially eating its own complex tissues muscle, protein, just to scrape together enough energy. So when we intervene, we've got two major highways, you could say, for delivering this necessary fuel.
Okay, highway number one, enteral nutrition. That means using the GI tract, if at all possible. And highway number two.
That's parenteral nutrition, often called TPN, Total Parenteral Nutrition. That's the bypass route. It delivers fuel intravenously straight into the bloodstream.
So if you need to get up to speed quickly on the mechanisms, the different formulations, and maybe most importantly, the strict safety protocols for these therapies, we've synthesized the critical insights for you right here. Our mission today is to unpack the protocols that honestly make the difference between recovery and catastrophic metabolic failure. Let's dive in.
All right. We always try to start with enteral nutrition because, well, the simple rule is if the gut works, use it. It's definitely the preferred route and for a really profound clinical reason.
Yeah, and it seems like it's a reason directly linked to survival, particularly in critical care settings. The source material highlights that if a patient, maybe someone with severe burns or sepsis, gets early enteral nutrition, say within 24 to 72 hours, the risk of infection and overall complications drops significantly.
That's absolutely right. Just by keeping that intestinal lining active and functional, you really do reduce systemic morbidity. It's quite impactful.
Okay, so when a patient can't actually eat, we move to tube feeding. Now, the placement of that tube is key, and it sounds like there are quite a few options.
There are. We have the naso routes first. These start in the nose. You've got the nasogastric tube, or NG tube, which goes just to the stomach. Then there are the more advanced nasoduodenal and nasojejunal tubes, which actually bypass the stomach and deliver nutrients further down into the small intestine.
And those are typically shorter term, right?
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
Then you have the options for longer-term support, which are surgically placed. There's the gastrostomy, or G tube, which goes directly through the abdominal wall into the stomach, and the jejunostomy, or J tube, which goes directly into the jejunum, part of the small intestine. The choice really depends on the patient's condition and how much of the GI tract we need to, well, skip.
Okay, so once you've got the delivery route sorted, the formula itself needs to match the gut's ability to actually process it. You mentioned fighting catabolism earlier. What are the main types of formulas we need to know? There are 4 core ones, right?
That's right. They range from, let's say, easy digestion all the way to closest to a normal meal. So at the high support end, you have the elemental formulation. Think of this as pre-digested food simple dipeptides, tripeptides. Because it requires minimal digestive effort from the body, we use these when the GI tract is really compromised. Maybe severe pancreatitis or short bowel syndrome. It gives the gut a much-needed break.
That makes total sense. It promotes anabolism without really taxing a system that's already struggling.
Precisely. That. The most common one is probably the polymeric formulation. This is kind of the standard workhorse. It contains complex, intact proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. It's the closest thing to eating normally via a tube, and it's preferred when the gut is mostly functional. And because it's less concentrated, less hyperosmolar than the elemental types, it's generally better tolerated. Examples like Ensure, which is often lactose-free, usually cause fewer GI problems like diarrhea.
Right. And then you get into more specialized needs.
Yeah, exactly. Modular formulations are basically single nutrients. So you mentioned fighting catabolism. If we need to specifically ramp up protein intake to prevent muscle wasting, we can add a protein module, something like benoprotein, directly into the standard feed. It lets you customize the mix very precisely. You can do the same with carbs, like Modicol, or fats, like microlipid.
Very adaptable.
It is. And finally, the most specialized are the altered amino acid formulations. These are really niche cocktails designed for specific metabolic disorders like patients with liver failure, kidney impairment, or genetic conditions like phenylketonuria, where the body just can't process certain amino acids correctly.
Okay, so even though we prefer using the gut, enteral feeding isn't without risks. You hear about potential problems. What's the biggest clinical danger we need to be aware of?
The biggest one, the one that keeps nurses vigilant, is definitely aspiration pneumonia. If the patient isn't positioned correctly, maybe lying too flat, or if that feeding tube accidentally gets misplaced, the stomach contents can reflux back up and get into the lungs. That risk alone dictates several really critical nursing protocols we should probably discuss later.
Definitely. I also remember reading about dumping syndrome in the source material that sounds, well, unpleasant.
Oh, it's more than unpleasant. It causes profound patient discomfort. It's an adverse effect that happens with rapid feeding, especially into the jejunum. Highly concentrated nutrients flood the small intestine too quickly. The body reacts quite dramatically, flushing, sweating, nausea, sometimes fainting, and then explosive diarrhea. It's basically a rapid osmotic shift that overwhelms the system.
Wow. Okay. And then there's that critical drug interaction we absolutely cannot miss, phenytoin.
Yes. This is huge. For patients on seizure medication, this requires absolute protocol adherence. Tube feedings can actually bind with phenytoin and drastically reduce its absorption.
Leading to potential seizures.
Exactly, which can be catastrophic.
Hmm.
The standard recommendation you'll see is to stop the feeding for 2 full hours before giving the phenytoin, and then hold it for another 2 full hours afterwards.
That's a 4-hour window without nutrition.
It is. And if the patient is on a continuous feed where stopping isn't practical, the clinical team often has to make the decision to switch the patient to IV phenytoin just to guarantee they maintain those therapeutic levels. You simply cannot risk breakthrough seizures. It's a major safety point.
That phenytoin protocol really underscores why safety and adherence are so incredibly high stakes here. Okay, so let's pivot. If the gut is completely offline, maybe after complex surgery or severe persistent vomiting, or in cases of extreme cachexia where the body's just wasting away, we have to go to the bypass plan, Total Parenteral Nutrition, TPN.
Right, and this is a major, major intervention. Because we're injecting these highly concentrated nutrients directly into the bloodstream, bypassing all the body's natural filtration and digestive processes, the safety measures have to be extreme. A non-negotiable protocol that's stressed in the text is that TPN orders must be double-checked by 2 nurses before that bag is even spiked and administration begins.
2 nurses every time.
Every single time. It's that critical.
Okay, and TPN itself breaks down into 2 main delivery routes, Peripheral TPN or PPN and Central TPN, CPN. How do they differ?
The key difference really boils down to how much nutritional punch you need to deliver and for how long you need to deliver it. Think of PPN, Peripheral Parenteral Nutrition, as maybe a temporary bridge loan. It uses a peripheral vein, like in the arm, and it's intended for short-term needs, typically fewer than 14 days.
And because it's going into a smaller vein?
Exactly. To protect that smaller peripheral vein from irritation, the dextrose concentration has to be kept relatively low, generally under 10%. The main downside is that you often have to give larger fluid volumes to meet the patient's full caloric needs, and not every patient can tolerate that extra fluid.
Okay, so PPN is temporary, lower concentration, higher volume potentially. What about CPN, Central Parenteral Nutrition? Sounds more heavy duty.
It is. You could call CPN the long-term mortgage of nutritional support. It's for situations requiring nutritional support for 7 days or longer. And crucially, it requires a central venous catheter placed in a large vein like the subclavian or jugular or a PICC line.
Why the big vein?
Because that allows us to safely infuse highly concentrated solutions. We're talking dextrose concentrations often ranging from 10% all the way up to 35%, sometimes even higher. This lets us deliver the patient's total nutritional requirements, even if they are fluid restricted.
So with PPN, the big risk is localized irritation phlebitis, because that solution, even under 10%, is still pretty hyperosmolar for a small vein.
Correct. Chemical irritation of the vein is the main concern there. But the risks associated with CPN, the central line, are much more systemic and potentially severe. Because that catheter tip sits in a major vessel right near the heart, and the solution is incredibly rich in sugar, the risk of bloodstream infection leading to sepsis is significantly higher.
A huge risk.
A huge risk. Plus, infusing those highly concentrated volumes directly into central circulation makes metabolic chaos a real possibility. Think sudden, severe hyperglycemia, or if things swing the other way, hypoglycemia. Careful monitoring is absolutely essential.
Right. Let's break down that TPN recipe then. What are the main building blocks that make up this specialized IV fuel?
Okay, first up we have amino acids. These are the fundamental building blocks for protein synthesis. It's pure anabolism right there, and they provide energy too, about 4 kilocalories per gram. They get classified as essential, meaning the body can't make them itself, and non-essential.
And semi-essential.
Ah, yes. There are also semi-essential amino acids, like histidine and arginine. These are interesting because rapidly growing infants and children absolutely need them from their diet, but healthy adults can usually synthesize enough on their own. Needs change based on metabolic stress and growth.
Okay, amino acids for building. Then the main energy source, the fuel, is carbohydrates, delivered as dextrose, right?
Yes, exactly. Dextrose usually provides the largest chunk of the calories in TPN, about 3.4 kilocalories per gram. And this is where you see that critical concentration difference again. Kept under 10% for PPN to protect peripheral veins, but it can climb much higher, sometimes up to 50%, in CPN formulations delivered via a central line.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And the third component, fats or lipid emulsions. Why are these included? They seem important.
They are incredibly important for two main reasons. First, they are by far the most calorically dense component, packing a punch at 9 kilocalories per gram. The text mentions figure 42.2, visually showing how much denser they are, so they're a great source of energy. But arguably more importantly, they supply essential fatty acids.
Like linoleic acid.
Precisely. Linoleic and linolenic acids. The body cannot make these, and they are absolutely vital for things like maintaining cell membrane integrity and producing certain hormones. They're not just calories, they're crucial structural components.
And if a patient doesn't get these essential fatty acids through the TPN, the deficiency signs are pretty specific.
They are, and they can be quite visible. The text mentions figure 42.3 showing some of these. You'd look for signs like hair loss, a characteristic scaly dermatitis, poor or delayed wound healing. Basically, the body lacks the fundamental materials it needs to maintain skin integrity and repair tissues effectively. You might also see thrombocytopenia. Trace elements like chromium, copper, iodine, manganese, selenium, zinc are also vital, often added separately or in multivitamin infusions, MBIs.
Okay, that really covers the what and why of both routes. Let's talk about the how, the nursing process, and crucial safety measures during implementation.
Absolutely critical. Whether we're dealing with enteral feeding via the gut or parenteral via the vein, the safety steps are paramount. It always starts with a thorough assessment. This usually involves consulting with a registered dietitian, who is key in formulating the right plan. And then getting those baseline lab studies is essential, things like total protein, albumin, blood urea nitrogen, BUN, electrolytes, hemoglobin, hematocrit. You need to know the patient's nutritional and metabolic starting point.
Okay, let's drill down on enteral tube safety first. You mentioned the high risk of aspiration pneumonia earlier, so patient positioning is non-negotiable. Why that specific 30 to 45 degree elevation?
It's all about gravity. Keeping the head of the bed elevated to at least 30, preferably 45 degrees, during the feeding and for at least an hour after the feeding stops, helps prevent the stomach contents from refluxing back up into the esophagus and potentially entering the airway. It's a simple but vital mechanical intervention to reduce that aspiration risk.
Makes sense. And checking the tube placement. It's not just about listening for a whoosh sound anymore, is it?
No, that's considered unreliable now. The gold standard for bedside confirmation is aspirating gastric fluid from the tube and checking its pH. If the pH is 5.5 or lower, that strongly indicates correct placement in the acidic environment of the stomach.
And if it's higher or you can't get any fluid back?
Then you stop. If you're uncertain about placement for any reason, or if you can't aspirate fluid, feeding cannot begin or continue until placement is confirmed, usually by an X-ray. You simply cannot risk feeding into the lungs or the esophagus.
Right. Then there's the issue of checking gastric residual volumes, the GRVs. How does that work?
This is done to assess tolerance and prevent overfilling the stomach, which also increases aspiration risk. You gently aspirate the stomach contents before the next feeding or at regular intervals for continuous feeds. The exact volume limits vary a bit by institution, maybe 150 to 500 milliliter, but a common practice is to hold the feeding if the residual volume is more than the volume delivered over the previous 2 hours for continuous feeds, or maybe more than 50% of the volume of the previous bolus feed. Then you recheck later.
Okay. And preventing those frustrating tube clogs. What's the best practice?
Regular flushing is key. The best practice is flushing with at least 30 milliliters of lukewarm water before and after feedings, and before and after giving medications. Definitely not acidic juices like cranberry juice or carbonated beverages. Those can actually curdle the protein in the formula and make clogs worse.
And if a clog does happen,
Gentle flushing with warm water first. If that doesn't work, there are specialized enzyme-based declogging kits like Clog Zapper that can sometimes dissolve stubborn clogs, but you'd only use those according to very specific institutional protocols.
okay. And medication administration via the tube sounds like a high-risk area for errors.
It absolutely is. It requires meticulous attention. First, you must stop the feeding pump or hold the bolus feed. Then you prepare and administer medications one at a time. Liquid medications should be diluted, and tablets need to be thoroughly crushed and mixed with purified water. And critically, you must flush the tube with at least 15 millimolars of purified water before giving the first med, between each medication if giving more than one, and after the last medication.
And never mix meds directly into the formula bag or syringe.
Never, ever. That can lead to incompatibilities, tube clogs, and altered drug absorption. Keep the formula and the meds separate.
Got it. Okay, let's pivot back to TPN safety now. Because we're dealing with central lines and those highly concentrated sugar solutions, infection and metabolic chaos are the big fears, right?
Those are the primary concerns, yes. For infection prevention, strict aseptic technique during all aspects of care dressing changes, tubing changes, accessing the line is non-negotiable. The TPN tubing itself, because it's constantly filled with that nutrient-rich solution, must be changed with every new bag of TPN, or at a minimum every 24 hours, depending on hospital policy.
And managing the metabolic risks, especially with all that dextrose.
Constant vigilance. Serum glucose levels must be monitored frequently, typically every 6 hours, especially when starting TPN or changing the rate. Hyperglycemia is very common.
And if the infusion falls behind schedule, we absolutely cannot just crank up the rate to catch up.
Absolutely not. Never accelerate the infusion rate arbitrarily. Pushing that concentrated dextrose in too quickly can overwhelm the body's insulin response and cause severe, sudden hyperglycemia, potentially leading to dehydration or even hyperosmolar states. You stick to the prescribed rate.
And the flip side, what happens if TPN needs to be stopped suddenly?
That's dangerous too. If TPN is abruptly discontinued, the patient's pancreas is still producing high levels of insulin in response to the high glucose load it was receiving. Suddenly cutting off the glucose source can lead to rebound hypoglycemia. So if TPN has to be stopped unexpectedly, you typically need to infuse a solution of 5% or 10% dextrose, D5W or D10W, for a period to allow the body to gradually adjust and prevent that blood sugar crash.
So you're constantly babysitting the patient's entire metabolic system.
That's a good way to put it. You also need to monitor closely for signs of fluid overload, especially with CPN where large volumes might be needed, or if the patient has underlying heart or kidney issues. Look for hypertension, tachycardia, shortness of breath, crackles in the lungs, confusion, pitting edema. If you see those signs, you slow the rate immediately and notify the provider.
Okay, this has been a really thorough look at both systems.
Yeah.
Can you quickly recap the core distinctions and risks?
Sure, so the main takeaway. Enteral nutrition using the gut is always preferred if possible. It maintains gut function, has a lower risk of systemic infection like sepsis, but you have to watch out for potential GI intolerance like dumping syndrome, and critically prevent aspiration pneumonia through positioning and placement checks. Parenteral nutrition, TPN, is the intravenous route reserved for when the GI tract is non-functional. PPN is peripheral, short-term, lower concentration, with phlebitis as a key risk. CPN is central, long-term, high concentration, allowing full nutritional support but carries those significant risks of sepsis due to the central line, and major metabolic complications like hyper or hypoglycemia. For both, meticulous nursing care and strict adherence to protocol, like that 2-nurse TPN check, are the only real safeguards.
Perfect summary. Okay, now for you, the learner, here's something to mull over based on what we've discussed. We briefly touched on that case study from the text LP. A pregnant patient who needed TPN via PPN because of severe nausea and vomiting. Her nurse explained she'd need regular blood glucose monitoring, and LP got quite distressed, asking, "Does this mean I have diabetes now?" So, based on our conversation today, first, why was PPN likely chosen initially for LP instead of jumping straight to CPN? And second, thinking about the TPN components and metabolic effects we detailed, what's the nurse's best, most accurate, and hopefully reassuring response to LP's question about now having diabetes? Think about those PPN characteristics, duration limits, concentration limits, and the direct impact of that infused dextrose on blood pressure, even in someone without pre-existing diabetes. How would you explain that connection clearly and calmly? Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the pharmacology of nutritional support. From the Last Minute Lecture team, we really appreciate your dedication to mastering this essential knowledge.